So I wanted to begin with a fairly broad overview of just some of the key tactical challenges that we would suggest are prevalent within health economic modeling in rare disease spaces. Firstly, I think the most pertinent is likely the fact that, of course, if we have very little precedent, there's very little example of a disease area having been modeled in the first place, particularly with regard to whether actually the disease area has been modeled with a view to submitting to an HTA body, a health technology assessment appraiser. If there's not a lot of that, then naturally what follows is that actually creating a conceptualization of the patient journey, of the treatment paradigm around that patient journey and the nuances around that patient journey, and some additional key assumptions associated with how we model that patient journey. We actually have to sometimes, frankly, come up with these largely by scratch. And it's either by scratch in sense of a de novo approach, or it's very possibly going to be, if we can, leveraging as much as we can in learning terms from analogous diseases, trying to leverage as much as we can from learnings, essentially from HTA appraisal, feedback of the past on something that's rather similar, that allows us to consider, okay, these were key learnings for a very similar disease area in which the health economic model was developed. It is plausible that these will be relevant to us, and so we're going to tentatively adopt these and look to validate these as we go down the path of model development. Next, we have, of course, inherent within rare diseases, a concern around the trials that are run. Now, the trials are typically run to a very high standard in Europe, in these Western world markets, without a doubt. But indeed, inherent within the rare disease space is that quite often we're dealing with small sample sizes, and indeed short trial follow-up. It's actually a dual condition put upon our samples, the sample data that we have, that all contributes ultimately to a greater sense of uncertainty. So if we consider that we began based on limited precedent of modeling exercises, that we began with an uncertainty around the structures that we ought to be accommodating or using to accommodate expected clinical patient pathway and treatment paradigms, if that's uncertain and needs to be validated, that's compounded with an uncertainty associated with actually not much patient level data available from the trials in which we're interested. So not enough patients sometimes, and not enough time passed within the trial to ensure we're hitting final endpoints of interest. And of note, with respect to small sample sizes, as you might appreciate, I think most on the call may appreciate the concept that, of course, we're sometimes interested in breaking down our population into subsets. Sometimes the HTA body in question will have stipulated in advance or in its guidance that within this disease area or collection of disease areas, they're interested in considering, okay, an overall benefit of this therapy against the next best comparator, but actually also within perhaps certain clinical or demographic subgroups. And indeed, of course, once we start cutting down that already small sample size with short follow-ups into smaller groups, the uncertainty is just exponentially increased. If we cycle round to the bottom right here, a fairly similar consideration associated with that is that we actually are likely to have trouble. This is associated to the short trial follow-up. We're likely to have trouble getting data on final endpoints of interest. So, for example, if we're thinking about a very rare oncology indication, it may be the case that overall survival is rarely attained within clinical trials or reported subsequently in the literature. So not much data on overall survival in this hypothetical context. And so actually what we may be required to use would be clinically validated previously, or indeed what we're looking to later validate as appropriate surrogate endpoints, something that we deem to be, with good grounds, to be a good intermediate predictor of that final endpoint. So overall survival, perhaps predicted by progression-free survival, perhaps predicted by overall survival at 12 months. It's an arbitrary example, but hopefully one that is illustrative of the problem. Now, naturally, if we're using surrogate endpoints, this is a structural uncertainty that a degree of uncertainty that we're introducing that cannot necessarily be overcome, with the exception of, and I'll touch on this later, employing as much transparency as we can so that it is as clear as possible to the HTA body what we've done and why we've done it, as well as making sure we are validating this as extensively as possible with key clinical experts within the field and external health economists if necessary. To validate and justify the use of our surrogate endpoints and the inferences from which we draw from that surrogate endpoint with respect to what we expect the final endpoint to look like. Anyway, it's a key problem within orphan disease health and economic modeling, essentially, that final endpoints can be very hard to attain. And cycling round to the bottom left here, interestingly, of course, quite often we're going to have a clinical trial around which we're developing a health economic model for a rare disease treatment. That, because we have that clinical trial, we're likely to have, albeit a paucity of, but some data for the intervention of interest that we're interested in. But we're not necessarily going to have the same data having been replicated or equally, on an equal basis, produced for comparator treatments, interestingly, right? So it may be that comparator treatments were conducted, went through HTA a long time ago. They may not have gone through HTA. It may not be quite as clear as we'd like exactly what inputs they were using, what assumptions they were using. The data may not be cut in the way that that matches the trial of interest that we're dealing with at the moment. And essentially, there's a myriad of concerns there around, does the client's intervention trial really, can it be supported compared against actually other comparator trials? This is often a concern around which our development of the concept of the structure for our model must account for. It must be accounting for that. For not just suiting the trial that we're dealing with directly, but also what's been done for comparators in the past. An associated problem associated with sparse data, I wanted to call out particularly actually disease management costs, because quite often we're dealing with a lack of precedence for having modeled the disease area historically, and the lack, therefore, of HTA critiques or criticisms for the assumptions made or some of the costs leveraged for that. It can also be the case that actually attaching credible, well-cited disease management costs to the health states or the events that we deem relevant for the model can be very challenging indeed. And I'll touch later on a concept whereby we actually quite often we look to either go to proxy diseases for this purpose, or actually to think more in terms of micro-costing. So to think in terms of, we've got different events and health states, and we've got to consider, well, what are the constituent parts of that that event or that experience that a patient is experiencing? What are they likely to be exhibiting in terms of their clinical outputs? What are they likely to be treated with? Where are they going to be treated? For how long? So we want to consider in detail, try, particularly with orphan medicine disease areas, to think in detail about what are the costs we're likely to experience, given that there's not a great deal of evidence previously that we can leverage for telling us how much it costs to manage these patients.